On the pale morning of December 1st, 1948, a well-dressed man lay face up against the seawall at Somerton Beach, near Glenelg in Adelaide. He had no identification and no wallet. His eyes were open to a bright winter sky. A tiny scrap of paper reading, "Tamam Shud," and a torn page from a book turned what could have been a routine death into a decades-long mystery that would test the limits of memory, science, and human patience. The morning of December 1st, 1948 felt ordinary along the seawall. Trams on Jetty Road, gulls calling, the smell of brine and coal smoke. But when a passerby alerted police to a man slumped in a suit and tie, the ordinary turned urgent. He was middle-aged and well-groomed, shoes polished, face pale against the concrete, hands relaxed as if he were sleeping. There was no wallet, no identification, and disturbingly, laundry labels had been snipped from his clothes. Pulses quickened at the Adelaide police station because those small details suggested deliberation rather than accident. The initial autopsy found no bullet or blunt trauma and no obvious sign of struggle. Pathologists could not explain his internal chemistry with the tests available at the time. The press soon christened him the Somerton Man, and the case began to take on a cinematic life. A man with no past. The first real puzzle came later that day when an officer found, in a small concealed seam of his trousers, a tightly rolled scrap printed with the words "Tamam Shud," Persian for finished or ended. That scrap matched the missing last page of a battered edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a book police traced to a car parked near the beach, and then to a local woman named Jessica Thompson. Mrs. Thompson was a nurse who lived nearby. Her interactions with detectives were odd enough to raise fresh questions. Had the man known her? Who had torn out the page? And why had someone hidden that final word in the dead man's pocket? Those early clues hardened into a case where almost every discovery begged more questions than answers. Detectives carried the battered Rubaiyat back to the station like evidence in a small reliquary, and the interview room took on the smell of old paper and cigarette smoke. The missing last page matched the scrap perfectly, and tucked into the flyleaf was a faint penciled telephone number and the name of a local nurse. That lead took officers to the quiet house of Jessica Thompson in Glenelg, and her account would become a hinge in the story. She told them she owned the book and that she did not know the dead man, though she later admitted she had once given medical advice to a man who might have matched the Somerton man's description. What disturbed investigators most was not a single denial, but a pattern of loose ends. The unidentified man wore clothing stripped of laundry tags. His shoes had no resale marks, and buried in his trousers was a scrap printed with the words, "Tamam Shud." Beside it, investigators later discovered a handwritten string of capital letters that looked nothing like a poem. The coded message fascinated cryptographers. University students, bored radio operators, and retired code breakers tried substitution, vigenere, and transposition ciphers with no clear hit. Some argued it was not a military cipher but a personal shorthand, or a book cipher keyed to the Rubaiyat itself, a maddeningly plausible idea, since the torn book and the coded scrap were found together. At the same time, forensic science was failing to produce answers. The original autopsy recorded an apparently healthy liver, a heart of normal weight, and no sign of violent trauma, but late 1940s toxicology was a blunt instrument. Later review of the coroner's files found pages missing and annotations added after the fact, which made researchers suspect that important notes on stomach contents or chemical assays had been lost or altered. That combination, an undeciphered code, a torn book whose owner seemed evasive, and autopsy records that could not be fully trusted, turned a local death into a riddle that pulled in amateur sleuths, journalists, and intelligence officers. Over decades, the case became a test bed for what forensic work could become. In the 21st century, the case left the newspapers and moved into the labs. A plaster death mask made in the days after the Somerton man's burial turned into an unlikely treasure trove. Its skin indentations were photographed and scanned by forensic artists to produce modern, three-dimensional reconstructions that brought a man with cold blue eyes and a narrow nose into our present. In Adelaide, electrical engineer Derek Abbott and a circle of volunteers turned curiosity into systematic, programmatic science. They cataloged photographs, re-examined coroner transcripts, and pushed for genetic testing. The bigger obstacles were time and contamination. For decades, microbiologists and genealogists argued the available material was too compromised. Yet new methods in next-generation sequencing and single nucleotide polymorphism analysis offered a way around ruined samples. Teams learned to pull minute fragments of nuclear DNA from a hardened bone, and even from hairs embedded in plaster, separating ancient contamination from a true biological signal. As they worked, the story became entangled with bureaucracy. Some coroner files had pages excised. Other documents bore later pencil notes that nearly erased early conclusions. That suggested to amateur investigators two possibilities. Either the tests of 1948 had missed something modern labs could find, or earlier hands had smoothed away inconvenient truths. It also reopened an espionage theory that had shadowed the mystery since 1949. The Cold War was in its infancy in 1948, and intelligence services on both sides watched strange arrivals with suspicion. The Somerton man's meticulous appearance and the coded scrap made a spy story an attractive narrative, and security files quietly confirmed that agencies had at least glanced at the case. Cryptographers, too, had not given up. Using linguistic analysis, pattern matching, and computer-assisted frequency analysis, researchers found the text lacked the hallmarks of a classical military cipher and instead behaved like a personal condensation of words, possibly keyed to stray lines in the Rubaiyat. That idea is tantalizing. If the code was a book cipher, the torn Rubaiyat might be the key. If it was shorthand, only someone close to the author would understand. And if the DNA now being assembled could link to a distant living cousin, then paper, code, and corpse could finally be read together as parts of one human life. Pressure built until it felt physical. In a private cemetery on the edge of Adelaide, a small group of archaeologists, coroners, and police met before dawn to exhume a grave that had lain untouched for more than 70 years. The air smelled of damp eucalyptus and diesel as trowels moved earth and work lights through harsh shadows across an anonymous headstone. Later, in sterile labs, technicians wore disposable gowns and a kind of religious calm as they ground bone and isolated molecules, one batch at a time. What had been impossible with 1940s chemistry was now within reach. The laboratories produced a genomic single nucleotide polymorphism profile, large enough for investigative genetic genealogy. That profile was uploaded to research databases, and a web of family trees began to sprout. For the first time, the Somerton man was not just a face in a photograph, but a genome that could be triangulated into branches of living families. That did not mean a tidy name overnight. Instead, genealogists produced a short list of clusters, people whose ancestors had migrated between the British Isles, Australia, and New Zealand in the early 20th century. That geography matched subtle clues from the man's clothing and from a copy of the Rubaiyat that had circulated locally, but it also opened new ethical debates about consent and privacy. Meanwhile, cryptanalysts kept returning to the coded scrap. Modern pattern recognition showed the letter groups behave differently from standard ciphers. Some successful experiments used the Rubaiyat's text as a key to produce partially readable phrases, but each result required assumptions that could not be checked without knowing who might have written it. The autopsy file remained thorny. Researchers found scribbled marginalia in state archives that suggested earlier toxicology notes had been misfiled. Specialists argued that modern toxicology could identify residues of compounds like digitalis or newer barbiturates, if any preserved material remained. In other words, the three pillars of the case, code, book, and corpse, were now all moving forward at once. For the first time in decades, investigators in Adelaide could hold all three clues up to the light and see where their edges matched. The breakthrough did not answer every question, but it changed the scale of the hunt. What had been a ghost story became a methodical investigation into identity, with living people and living science finally in the same room. The turning point wasn't a dramatic reveal, but a quiet phone call. A genealogist said the letters on a screen were no longer anonymous. An SNP profile produced from bone had given researchers a string of genetic breadcrumbs that led to living descendants whose paper trails traced back to ports in England and towns in New Zealand. The Somerton man ceased to be an abstraction and became someone with kin. The work shifted from code breaking to conversation. Police and researchers asked permission to contact relatives, seeking photos, scars, health histories, and any memory of a man who left and never returned. Toxicologists ran tests on preserved stomach tissue and hair for alkaloids and other compounds undetectable in 1948, while cryptanalysts used the new biographical context to retest hypotheses about the coded scrap. If the message was a personal cipher keyed to a line in the Rubaiyat, a remembered turn of phrase by a living aunt might confirm it. The immediate consequence was both small and profound. A cluster of people with secrets to tell and the legal and ethical work required to bring those stories into daylight. For the first time in decades, the case had hands to hold and a door to knock on. The Somerton man's last words, "Tamam Shud," now felt less like an ending and more like a summons. The Somerton man case matters for more than just one identity. It forced a rethink about evidence preservation, chain of custody, and the power of genetic genealogy to connect people across generations. Police in Adelaide have had to balance a public hunger for closure with legal and ethical frameworks that barely existed when the mystery began in 1948. The case changed how coroners store material, how libraries treat rare books, and how archivists preserve fragile notes, because even a lost scrap can hold a life. It also pushed advances in toxicology, showing that compounds once invisible to medicine can now be detected decades later. And it raised hard questions about privacy and consent when living people are contacted because of a dead man's DNA. Culturally, the story remains powerful because it is both a riddle and an act of mourning. A nameless person frozen on a beach, and a family possibly still waiting to learn what happened. Even if the code is never cracked and the book remains symbolic, new science has already narrowed the search to people you could knock on. The Somerton man is no longer merely a mystery, but a test of how forensic imagination, compassion, and patience can turn Tamam Shud into a beginning, not an end.